So content, we're going to now talk about the next part of sort of organizing information on your page, and it's really all about content. So whenever you design your digital product or service or your email or whatever, you need to eliminate question marks from the user. So what happens normally when a user enters your email or your web page or your landing page, they ask themselves a number of questions. So they ask themselves, where am I? Where do I need to begin? Where did they put X or Y? What are the most important things on the page? Why did they call it that? So all these types of questions are questions that the user has in their head. And whenever we design our product or service, we need to kind of overcome these questions. Because what these questions do is add something called cognitive load, which I talked about again a little earlier, didn't I? And the user basically increases the likelihood of them doing nothing if their cognitive load, or we talked about paradox of choice earlier, didn't we? If their cognitive load is too high, they're less likely to do things. So the way we get around this is we start thinking about design conventions, so ways that things have been done in the past. We create effective visual hierarchies of information, so we break up pages into specific areas, into specific blocks. We make it obvious what's clickable and what isn't. We eliminate distractions, and we kind of format content to support scanning. And we're going to talk about scanning in a second as well, and how users look at information on a page. So we talked a second ago about visual hierarchies, didn't we? And what's a visual hierarchy? So when we're thinking about designing pages or designing an email or a campaign, elements on the page should show what's the most important thing. So pages with a clear visual hierarchy have three traits. So more important should be more prominent. So the sort of more important information tends to go towards the top of the page. And it should also be logically grouped with other content. And then the third thing that we try and do whenever we're thinking about creating effective visual hierarchies is thinking about nesting visually the content, so that we know what's part of what. So if there was a section called computer books, we'd want that to appear above the titles of the individual books, for example. So reflecting that in your design is important. So an example here: you read this first. You will read this when skimming. You probably not read this on a skim. You will not read this unless a phrase is bolded. So some good examples of how you might want to organize your content, and that's using typography, which is a really useful way of creating that visual hierarchy. So another example, just to sort of summarize the points there. So the most noteworthy info is at the top: who, what, when, where, why, how. Then that important details, and then the sort of kind of background information from there. And every newspaper that you come across uses this type of principle. We're going to sort of give you a couple of examples in a second, but you can see that it's a really commonly used theory. So all it means that the user is that they don't have to process that information in such a in any sort of level of difficulty. They're able to just scan through the content and find exactly what it is that they need. So we talked about visual hierarchy and design patterns, and essentially what we start to find is that knowing what to include is really important, but also a lot of UX design is really all about taking stuff away. And artists like Da Vinci and Van Gogh knew exactly where to put stuff. They knew what color it should be, and they only did that through through years and years of painting. And UI designers or visual designers need to do that in a similar way. So they get to learn what works and what doesn't work, and they start to build up a list of rules and regulations. And ultimately that helps with creating a visual organization which is logical. And I think whenever we're thinking about creating organization from a visual perspective. We need to be able to inform users in a really subtle way. We want to sort of guide them down specific routes. So if you want customers to go down a specific user journey, for example, then we can do that through creating visual organization. And as I said earlier, creating content relationships and making them obvious is a really good way of doing that. And also things like creating emotional impacts. So people visit restaurants for more than just an edible meal. They want an experience, don't they? They want a taste, texture, presentation, etc., etc. So that's some of the considerations we should start thinking about. Whenever people read things, they do it in two different ways. They either have a look at that information using something called an F pattern or something called a Z pattern. And we're going to have a quick look at the F pattern. And we can see that there was a research done with Google on how people actually read information. And you can see that in this particular instance, what happens is they go to the top left first, and they scan along from left to right, and that's kind of how we read. They look to see if there's any useful information on there, and then what happens is that user scans down the left-hand margin, and then they scan across again. And what starts to happen is they start to form an F pattern or a Z pattern. In this particular instance, we're seeing an F pattern. But what we always need to think about is whenever we're designing a landing page, we need to kind of think about designing that with the F pattern in mind, don't we? Because obviously, whenever we're sort of wanting users to actually perform a particular action, a call to action perhaps, or buy something from us, or click on an email registration, for example, we need to sort of bear those types of things in mind. And the Nielsen and Norman Group conducted a readability study based on 232 users scanning thousands of websites, and it kind of elaborates what we already knew about the F pattern. And users rarely read every word of text. So when you're thinking about designing your content, you need to think about how can users actually scan through this and find exactly what it is that they're looking for. So the first two paragraphs, the most important, and should kind of contain your hook, your sort of key information. Start paragraphs and subheadings with bullet points, and bullet points with enticing keywords. So, getting people to engage. And a couple of really useful examples are news websites. So news websites really follow the F pattern. A couple of examples here, the CNN and the New York Times. So for example, we can see in this particular instance of the CNN website, North Korea, Trump's declared war. And that's the most important story, the breaking news story in the top left. So we know that people are going to see that with a really sort of prominent headline, and it's got the title "Breaking News" and a compelling image there. And then the next story along is another story about Donald Trump, isn't there? And how he's looking quite sad in this particular picture, and he's talking about the NFL protests that were going on a little bit about. And then we've got some information about the Pope. So you can see that kind of forms the top of the F. And likewise, if you have a look at the New York Times website, it's more or less the same in terms of how it's been designed. So it's kind of in that F pattern again, the most important headline in the top left. And then interestingly, the ad positions are actually in positions where users generally don't actually engage and view. So the way that ads are actually sold on websites is that they're sold often on a CPM basis, so cost per thousand basis. So you get impressions, but you can see that probably the click rates aren't actually going to be that high. The second scanning pattern is the Z pattern. So Z patterns occur when it's not just centered on a piece of text, for example. So often you find in some web designs that you've got kind of an image placeholder, you've got some information, and then when you've got a sort of clear call to action, the best place to have that clear call to action is on that right position there. And obviously there are exceptions to the rule. But the eye, again, that left to right, and then it scans back down to that copy, and then over to that call to action. So I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. So we covered off some interesting things there, didn't we? The F pattern, the Z pattern, and we talked about a little bit about some other elements of content. So we're next going to start thinking about how we can start applying some of these things in our everyday designs.